In this introductory lecture to the Gospel of John, we'll be looking at structure in John's Gospel, or what the ancient rhetoricians would call arrangement. Now I turn to look at the subject of structure. And looking at the structure of John's Gospel, particularly the first 12 chapters, is very informative for understanding what is being said in John's Gospel. Structure is one way that Gospel writers move from reporting the events to interpreting Jesus' life and message. And just as one simple example, look at how the feeding of the 5,000 is handled in Matthew 14 and in John 6 in different ways. The story, the event, is told in a very similar way, but the interpretation is different. What goes beyond just the event in Matthew's Gospel is a further teaching of Jesus to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And the disciples are at first confused, and they think Jesus is talking about bread and needing to take bread with them. But what Jesus is saying is beware of the teaching of the Pharisees, which then leads us to understand the feeding of the 5,000 as not just a miracle of feeding, but also an example of a concrete example of how Jesus will provide the right teaching for the disciples, represented by the 5,000 who are following Jesus. Jesus will give them the food that they need in his teaching. And now John takes the meaning of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6 in a direction that interprets Jesus' death. He says, "You must eat my body and drink my blood." So the feeding of the 5,000 points to what Jesus' death meant. And when John reports the feeding of the 5,000, he says it's about the time of Passover that this takes place. So the idea of Passover is also connected to the feeding of the 5,000 in John's Gospel. So the Gospel writers don't just report, but they also interpret the stories, and they can interpret the meaning of Jesus' life and message in different ways. The only way to see this is to read more than just the particular story on its own, but to see how it fits into the larger context. And so we do need to look at structure. The overall structure of the Gospel of John is that there is a prologue in the first 18 verses, and there is an epilogue in the last chapter, chapter 21. Then we have the public ministry of Jesus with 7 signs that run from chapter 1, verse 19, all the way through the end of chapter 12. And then we have the private ministry of Jesus in the farewell discourses that are to be found in chapter 13:1 through the high priestly prayer of Jesus in chapter 17, verse 26. Note, by the way, how the end of the Gospel of John in chapter 20 states the reason for writing, and then there is a similar thing said at the end of the epilogue in John 21:25. We read John 20:30 through 31. "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." And John 21:25 says, "But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." So Jesus is the focus of the Gospel of John, and the reason for writing these things is that the readers might come to belief. Belief in what? In that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that those who do believe will obtain life in his name. Where paying attention to the structure of John's Gospel can be particularly interesting is in the public ministry part of John's Gospel, the first 12 chapters. And in them we find signs. Now there's some discussion about what are the 7 signs, but here is a typical listing of them. The turning of water into wine at Cana, the royal official's son at Capernaum. These are the only 2 that are numbered, first and second signs, and both of them take place in Cana. Then we have the invalid at the pool of Bethzatha, or Bethesda as we sometimes say, the loaves and fishes by the Sea of Galilee, the miracle at sea, the blind man in Jerusalem, and then the raising of Lazarus in Bethany from the dead. Now, the structure in this section can also be looked at in terms of episodes where several stories are read together. And within them, we can find some of the signs, which is the middle column here. And the idea here is that within an episode, you have some signs, but then some discourses that help to interpret the sign. Remember what I said earlier about the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, and then the subsequent dialogue that leads the reader of that miracle story, that sign story, to interpret it in terms of the Lord's Supper, in terms of Jesus' death and eating his body and drinking his blood. So that's chapter 6 there. So what I'm going to do is just run through these episodes as they've been suggested by someone several decades back now named C.H. Dodd. In The Interpretation of the Fourth Gospel, Dodd presents these episodes this way, and there are variations among scholars, so this is just one way of doing it, but I'm going back to one of the early suggestions of this and giving you that view. So he says, for example, in the first episode, we run from chapter 2, verse 1 through 4:42. In that, he says we have a theme of the new beginning in which the old things have passed and the new things have come, borrowing words from 2 Corinthians 5:17 to describe this. So what do we have? Well, we've got sign number 1, the miracle at Cana. Now notice immediately here that Dodd suggested that the cleansing of the temple should be considered the second sign. Not many would follow him on that. But when Jesus does the miracle at Cana, he offers them new wine. And the water that is put into the jars of stone are put into jars that were for the purpose of purification. They had a religious purpose, as the text says. And so the water of cleansing is put into the purification jars, and Jesus turns it into a wine that represents blood at the Lord's table. And in this, then, he offers a new purification, not the purification that was required of cleansing by water in Jewish rituals, but a cleansing that goes far beyond that, a cleansing from Jesus himself. Then immediately we have Jesus cleansing the temple. So see how these stories are put together in order to teach something. And in the cleansing of the temple, Jesus' later dialogue is that he will replace the temple, destroy this body, and in 3 days it will be raised up. The understanding is that he's talking about destroying the temple and he's actually talking about his body. Well, that understanding leads us to a deeper understanding that Jesus is replacing the temple as what will offer cleansing for the Jews. And then we have the story of Nicodemus. Well, in Nicodemus we have the language of new birth. And Jesus says you must be born from above. The Greek word is anothen. Now, anothen can also mean again. And so Nicodemus misunderstands Jesus and says, you mean I need to be born again in a physical way? But Jesus is talking about a new birth that is from above. And then in the story of the Samaritan woman and Jesus at the well, Jesus says, look, you've been coming here for centuries to get water from this well that Jacob had dug. But I'm going to give you a water that you'll never have to drink again, because it's a water that is a living water. And she says, give this to me to drink. And Jesus is talking about the Spirit. And so it's a new water. And he says, you will neither worship here, as you Samaritans do on Mount Gerizim, nor will we worship in Jerusalem anymore, but we will worship in spirit and in truth. All right, so looking at all of this together, there's a new beginning at Cana, there's a new beginning at the temple, there's a new birth, new beginning for Nicodemus, and there's a new beginning for the Samaritan woman personally, as well as for the Samaritans and for the Jews in terms of worship. Now, it may be that our first episode should include the last story in chapter 4, which is also a story about the new life that Jesus gives to the royal official's son when he comes to Cana to ask Jesus to heal his son back in Capernaum, and Jesus does. Maybe that also fits this perspective. So again, we can look at this differently. Some scholars will disagree on some aspects of this, but overall, the main point is read stories together in John's Gospel and you'll see that they fit a theme. Dot suggests that the second episode can be spoken of in terms of the theme of the life-giving word. Christ is the giver of life. And he says that in this section we have 2 healings and 1 discourse. So he puts the healing of the nobleman's son in this second episode, along with the healing of the lame person at the pool of Bethesda or Bethzatha in chapter 5, followed by a discourse that continues to interpret the signs. Part 1 has the theme God's perpetual activity, giving life and creating, is also part of Christ's activity. And this draws Jesus into the divine identity because he gives life and creates as well. Jesus performs divine work, but in complete obedience to the Father. And then part 2 is the theme of witness, coming in the last part of chapter 5. And so he argues these then hold together in terms of the life-giving word theme of Jesus Christ. The third episode is all of chapter 6. We've already talked about it, how the theme is the theme of bread of life, and it begins with the feeding of the 5,000. And then that theme is developed in 3 stages, where Jesus begins talking about another feeding that took place in the history of the Jews, that is manna from heaven, and then the interpretation always coming back to Christ. So Jesus is the bread from heaven, is the interpretation, and then it intensifies as we move from the feeding of the Israelites in the wilderness to understand Jesus' new feeding of his disciples in terms of his body, his flesh, and his blood. He is the bread and the giver of bread. so he gives himself, his flesh and his blood. The fourth episode comes in chapters 7 and 8. And you'll notice as you look at the scripture verses, what's missing is John 7:53 through 8:11, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Early manuscripts simply don't have that story. And if you read from John 7:52 and then pick up in 8:12, you won't miss that story at all. It has been inserted into the text and really is not part of the original Gospel of John. It's in a lot of manuscripts, but the better manuscripts lack that story. This fourth episode is called Light and Life, and it has to do with the manifestation and rejection of Jesus. This is how Dodd looks at it. We'll talk about this later in terms of the feasts and festivals that Jesus attends and how he interprets himself regarding them at a later point in this lecture. Now, what we have here then is a single festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, and we have several dialogues that take place. And it's helpful to know what actually took place at that Feast of Tabernacles in order to understand some of the things that Jesus is saying. But I won't go into the details of that just yet. Just note here that it's a single festival that binds chapters 7 and 8 together, and that the theme is the theme of light and life. The fifth episode has to do with judgment by the light, following on what we just read in chapters 7 and 8. And here we have the sign of the man born blind. Notice he has no light in his eyes. At the pool of Siloam, and Jesus heals him. And then there's a discourse on the theme of the shepherd and the flock, and an appendix, says Dodd, of Jesus is rejected by the Jews and most explicitly tells who he is. So the rejection shows that they are rejecting the light and therefore will come under judgment, whereas Jesus gives the light to someone like the man at the pool. The sixth episode, Dodd says, is that the victory of life over death. And here we have the story of Lazarus. So it's told, but then there's a further description of this. And the theme has to do with life, eternal life, to be enjoyed here and now, and then the resurrection life, which is for the future. So it's an already not yet perspective on the life that Jesus offers in light of this event of raising Lazarus from the dead. In the seventh episode, we have life through death, the meaning of the cross, in chapter 12. And Dodd says in verses 37 to 50 of chapter 12, we have an epilogue to the book of signs, which means if you read those verses, you'll get a sense of the essence of John's theology in this section of John's Gospel, because he's summarizing what he wanted to say. Just as you will get the essence of what John wants to say in the prologue in chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. So the evangelist cements the story he has told, particularly in verses 44 to 50. It's a resume of the salient points of John's preaching. So let's read that section of John, chapter 12, verses 44 through 50, and notice what's in red. This is the Johannine theological language that we have come to learn by this point, and some of it's already been introduced in the prologue. Then Jesus cried aloud, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world, so that everyone who believes in me should not remain in the darkness. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my word as a judge. On the last day, the word that I have spoken will serve as judge, for I have not spoken on my own, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment about what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I speak, therefore, I speak just as the Father has told me. You can compare that to earlier in the Gospel of John, John 1:45 through 51. Then we have the private discourse of Jesus with his disciples that begins in chapter 13. Jesus' farewell address to his disciples. It comes in three parts in chapters 13 and 14. At the end of chapter 14, Jesus says, "Come, let's go from here." And you expect it all to be over, and yet in chapters 15 and 16, you get essentially the same thing that you found in chapter 14, repeated in different ways, as if the same story is being told again. But you get those two tellings that come to a climax in Jesus' prayer, his high priestly prayer, in chapter 17. We then get Jesus' passion and resurrection in chapters 18, 19, and 20, and then the epilogue that comes in chapter 21. Finally, I'd like to say something about structuring in John's Gospel that has to do with the numbering of syllables or words. And the next few slides will conclude the lecture by a look at how this works in the prologue, in the use of the terms lifted up and I am in John, and in the conclusions. In Greek, syllables can be counted in the prologue in John 1 through 18, and it will be discovered that they add up to 496 syllables. Now that happens to be a triangular number, and it's the third perfect number in Greek, as Richard Bauckham has pointed out. But what is particularly interesting is that it is also the value of the word monogenes. We've talked about how you can count Greek letters because the alpha, for example, stands for 1 and the beta stands for 2 and so forth. And there are a couple other symbols introduced into this, the charts at the bottom here of the slide, that shows you how you would assign value for different Greek letters, numerical values for different Greek letters. And then any word then has a numerical value. The numerical value of the word monogenes is 496. Monogenes means that one and only, or something like that. It's sometimes translated as only begotten, but the idea of begotten really is not part of the idea in the word. So the one and only, it's as if you have, how many children do you have? Well, I've got one child, an only child, and because the child is the only child, all the parental love goes toward that one child. That's the idea of monogenes, the one and only beloved Son of God. And so this word appears in verse 18 and verse 14 of the prologue, and it is a word used of Jesus. Its value is 496, and lo and behold, the syllables in Greek in the prologue add up to 496. Is this just coincidence? Well, furthermore, we have the words of the Lord's Prayer, beginning in the middle of verse 1 where the prayer begins, all the way to the end, verse 26 of chapter 17. If we add up the words, not the syllables this time, we come to 486. And you discover that the Greek word pater, which means father, when you address the Father, pater, father, um, that word also adds up to 486, the prayer of Jesus to the Father. So it's just an intriguing thing. We don't learn anything dramatic, nothing about the theology beyond what is already stated without knowing the numerical value issue, but it does show the careful structuring in John's Gospel. Now, the next example does have a theological significance. What we have here on this slide, running horizontally in 3 boxes, is the phrase lifted up. Notice John 3:14 to 15. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Notice the last box on the horizontal line, John 12:32 through 34. Here we learn that lifted up means crucified. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to indicate the kind of death he was to die. But lifted up not only means lifted up physically on a cross, but it also means to be lifted up in glory, to be glorified. And so there's the double meaning in the word lifted up. Now notice the vertical boxes, beginning with John 4:26 and ending with John chapter 18, 5 through 6 and 8. Here we have a different word. It's actually the phrase I am, ego eimi in Greek. Now, in John 4:26, our first box, we actually have the phrase I am he. But the Greek doesn't say I am he. It simply says I am the one who is speaking to you. And what we can call this is the absolute use of the term I am. The non-absolute use might be other places in John's Gospel where, for example, Jesus says, I am the door, or I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. This is non-absolute. But here, in these boxes in the vertical column, we have only the absolute use of I am, despite whatever translation you're looking at. And this is the NRSV. So what Jesus is actually doing is he's using language that God used of himself. It's reminiscent of the revelation of God to Moses in Exodus 3. He reveals himself as the one who is. But also in Isaiah chapter 47 and verses 8 and 10, God reveals himself and he says, I am, and there is no one beside me. The same phrase occurs in both verses 8 and 10 of chapter 47 in Isaiah. So what is said of God, that he has absolute existence in himself and there therefore is no one other than him, is now something that Jesus is using of himself. So Jesus in chapter 4 reveals himself as the I am to the Samaritan woman. Now, what's interesting here, and this is again something pointed out by Richard Bauckham, is that the very middle of the I am sections in John's Gospel is also the very middle of the lifted up sayings in John's Gospel, hence the cross shape here. Now, there's no reason to believe that John was thinking in terms of a cross, as is represented here, but he is thinking theologically in terms of the cross, because the lifted up sayings point to the cross, and the I am sayings point to God's identity. And what John is saying to us is that Jesus reveals the glory of the Father. when he is lifted up on the cross. The glory of Jesus in being lifted up is also a revelation of the glory of God, because he shares the same identity as the I am. And what is so profound here, and totally unique to Christianity, is the idea that to understand God most intimately is to understand that he is the one who will suffer and die on the cross for the sake of a sinful people. He will take away the sins of the world himself, and in so doing he reveals his divine glory. This is an amazing statement that John is making, and he makes it not only in the words that are used in these verses, but also the way he structures them together. We've seen that kind of structuring and how many times divine names are used in the book of Revelation. Well, here we have it again in another way, in an amazing way in John's Gospel. Chapter 21 in John's Gospel is an epilogue. We already have a conclusion at the end of chapter 20. Earlier in this lecture, we looked at John 20, 30 through 31, and compared how it said something similar to the conclusion that we have at the end of the epilogue in John 21, 24 to 25. What's interesting to note here is that the number of Greek words in both of the conclusions is the same. There are 43 words in Greek. Now, there is a textual issue to note about the first conclusion. Some manuscripts omit the single word his in verse 30 of John chapter 20. And then if this is the reading that is taken, then it equals 43 words. So if you follow that textual tradition, then you have the equal number of words in the two conclusions. So John requires some very careful consideration with respect to structure. We don't learn something deep, something hidden in the theology of John, some mystery that can be found if only we can be attuned to these interesting things that we've talked about in this lecture on structure. But if we do attend to John in these ways, we will find a deeper understanding of what he's up to, what he's doing, and we'll be able to appreciate him all the more.